Crime has a way of leaving its mark, but what about the ones that remain unsolved? Sometimes justice takes its time, decades even, until a shocking revelation brings the truth crashing into view. Get ready, because we're about to pull back the curtain on the most perplexing unsolved crimes, and what lies beneath may be more disturbing than you ever imagined. Let's begin with the case of Lisa Zeigert, a young woman whose life was stolen in 1992 under horrifying circumstances, and her case took 27 years to be resolved. Lisa Zeigert. In April 1992, 24-year-old Lisa Zeigert was working her second job at a gift shop in Agawam. She was kind, full of life, and beloved by everyone who knew her. Then, without warning, she vanished. Days later, her body was discovered in a wooded area near Suffield, brutally assaulted and murdered. Despite initial leads, the case grew cold, leaving her family and community grappling with unanswered questions for decades. In a dramatic turn, 27 years later, a renewed DNA effort and a handwritten confession led investigators to Gary Shara, a longtime suspect. In a stunning courtroom moment, Lisa's family faced Shara for the first time. The scene was emotional, yet filled with strength. Lisa's mother, Edi Zeigert, held a photo of her daughter as she declared, "You have been brought to justice for this, and she is here facing you."
I wanted the chance to face the person who actually did this to our Lisa and show him this picture and say, "You have been brought to justice for this, and she is here facing you. She is accusing you."
Shara, who had been on the radar since 1993 but kept a low profile, was now standing trial. He remained emotionless, watching proceedings from a holding cell. Evidence, including DNA from Lisa's body and handwritten notes allegedly admitting to the kidnapping, rape, and murder, sealed his fate. In the final chapter of this decades-long pursuit for justice, Gary Shara was handed the maximum punishment under Massachusetts law, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom, heavy with emotion, became a stage for the ultimate reckoning. Yet, as the sentence was read, Shara remained as cold and detached as he had been throughout the trial.
The court orders you to serve a term of life in prison without the possibility of parole.
His face. For Lisa's family, this was a moment of vindication. They had waited 27 long years for this day, enduring grief and unanswered questions while their daughter's killer lived freely. Shara's stoic demeanor only underscored the horror of his crime. A man capable of such brutality, yet completely unmoved by the weight of his sentence or the pain he caused. Throughout the trial, Lisa's family displayed remarkable strength. Her mother's words carried a mix of grief and resolution, a testament to decades of unyielding pursuit for justice. "I believe Lisa is in a good place, and she is at peace," she said, but admitted the family's own peace was shattered until now. After years of heartache and unanswered questions, Lisa's light, extinguished too soon, found its justice. The next case is one of the most shocking in American history. A man responsible for terrorizing families across California for over a decade turned out to be someone who lived among them, unnoticed. A predator hiding in plain sight. The Golden State Killer. Joseph James DeAngelo, the man eventually revealed as the Golden State Killer, left behind a trail of destruction that spanned 13 murders, over 50 rapes, and countless burglaries during the 1970s and 1980s. From Sacramento to Ventura, his reign of terror shattered lives and gripped entire communities with fear. But for decades, the identity of the man behind these heinous crimes remained a mystery, until a breakthrough in DNA evidence unmasked him in 2018. After years of evasion and silence, Joseph DeAngelo faced his victims and their families in a courtroom in Sacramento County. The sheer magnitude of his crimes made the trial a legal marathon. Just the recitation of DeAngelo's charges, 26 counts of murder and kidnapping, took over 15 minutes to announce in court. The list was staggering, detailing not just the murders, but the calculated brutality of how he carried them out, often targeting his victims in their own homes.
This is from a niece. As I sit down to write this letter, I realize there's only one place to start. I wish my deepest sympathy, sorrow, and pain relief to all of the victims. I cannot imagine what any of you endured. I'm simply writing this letter to tell you I do not know the person known as the Golden State Killer. In no time did I see anything that would have led me to believe that.
D'Angelo showed little to no emotion during the sentencing trial. His cold, unflinching demeanor mirrored the same detachment he had shown while committing his crimes decades earlier. For the victims' families, however, the day was a powerful, albeit bittersweet, moment of justice. Debbie Domingo, whose mother and stepfather were killed by D'Angelo, spoke of the long years of anguish and the importance of ensuring he would never harm another soul. The sentencing itself took nearly 3 hours, a grim testament to the extent of D'Angelo's crimes. As each count was read, the courtroom bore witness to the enormity of his savagery, the weight of his victims' voices, and the toll his actions had taken. Many family members spoke of the pain, loss, and trauma that D'Angelo had inflicted, sharing their stories with raw emotion. Dina Becton, the district attorney from Contra Costa County, reflected on the strength of these families. Over 4 decades, that's a long time to wait for justice to be served. Finally, we have arrived at that day. The boogeyman, the man whose horrific, unspeakable crimes devastated the lives of so many, will now serve the rest of his life behind bars.
Dina Becton, District Attorney for Contra Costa County. Over 4 decades. That's a long time to wait for justice to be served. Finally, we have arrived at that day. The day when those who have waited so very long will hear that Joseph D'Angelo will now serve the rest of his life behind bars.
In the end, Joseph D'Angelo himself spoke, a brief and hollow apology that many felt was too little, too late.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir.
D'Angelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the gavel came down, the courtroom erupted into applause, a cathartic release after decades of waiting. Though D'Angelo's testament of remorse rang hollow for many, the finality of his sentencing brought a measure of peace to the families.
Mr. D'Angelo, you're now remanded to the custody of the Sheriff of Sacramento to be delivered to the custody of Director of Corrections and Rehabilitation to serve the remainder of your life in state prison. We are adjourned.
Some cases take years to solve, others take decades. But this next story, it was as if the suspect couldn't help but incriminate himself in the most shocking way imaginable. Dwayne Keefe D. Davis. A rap legend's life cut short, an unsolved mystery spanning 27 years, and a suspect who confessed to his involvement in interviews, books, and even on podcasts. This is the story of Dwayne Keefe D. Davis and the murder of Tupac Shakur. Las Vegas, 1996. Rap icon Tupac Shakur was shot in a drive-by after a fight on the Strip. For 27 years, the case remained unsolved until Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, a self-proclaimed gangster, found himself at the center of the investigation. His own words, from interviews to his autobiography, helped prosecutors build their case.
Y'all need to come buy my book. Compton's a street legend. It's a good read, man. It's nothing but the truth.
In October 2023, Davis made his first court appearance in Las Vegas, shackled and subdued. The proceeding was brief, his attorneys weren't present, and the arraignment was delayed.
The record reflects that Mr. Davis is present in custody. Mr. DiGiacomo and Mr. Palal are here on behalf of the state. Mr. Davis, sir, have you retained counsel to represent you in this case?
Prosecutors argued that Davis orchestrated the murder. Their evidence? Decades of Davis's own public admissions. He openly described being in the white Cadillac the night Tupac was shot and identified his now deceased nephew, Orlando Anderson, as the gunman.
Half his body out the window. Yeah.
Orlando shot Tupac and Suge.
Yeah, he did his thing, yeah.
Davis's immunity agreement from a 2009 confession was voided because he repeatedly bragged about his involvement. As retired LAPD detective Greg Kading said, the primary witness against him is himself.
Orlando, not to tell nobody, right?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
I said, on this type of can't be telling nobody. That's the only way you're gonna stay free.
During subsequent hearings, Davis's legal team faced additional setbacks. A Nevada judge denied Davis's release on bail multiple times, citing concerns over the source of the $750,000 bond. Prosecutors argued that Davis's release would pose a flight risk and pointed to the circumstantial evidence, including his wife's hotel reservation on the Strip the night Tupac was murdered. After decades of silence, the courtroom echoed with the weight of Davis's own words. He also lashed out during his trial.
Address the court.
I think we're done.
I got something to say. Greg Kading had them boxes at his house for 15 years in his attic, doing all kind of TV interviews. The boxes should not be allowed in cases.
His trial, set to begin in 2025, will finally decide if justice can be served for Tupac Shakur, a case where the truth was spoken too loudly to ignore. Some killers strike fast and leave chaos in their wake, but the grim sleeper, he paused for over a decade, his silence as chilling as his crimes. The Grim Sleeper, Los Angeles, 1984 to 2007. A predator roamed the streets of South Central, targeting vulnerable black women during the crack epidemic. Many victims were found shot with a .25 caliber pistol, and their bodies were discarded like trash. For years, the murders went unsolved, their connection obscured until DNA breakthroughs brought justice decades later. It was August 10th, 2016, when Lonnie Franklin Jr., a former trash collector and garbage attendant, faced his reckoning in Los Angeles County Superior Court. Convicted of 10 murders and 1 attempted murder, Franklin sat emotionless as Judge Kathleen Kennedy delivered his sentence.
The defendant is not eligible for probation, and probation is denied.
Death. Victims' families addressed Franklin directly, voicing the pain they had endured for decades. Why did you do this? These women were defenseless. Judge Kennedy, visibly moved, called Franklin's crimes monstrous and affirmed society's right to decide that someone so brutal does not deserve to continue to live.
Person, as a punishment and as a protection for others, does not deserve to continue to live. And I can't think of anyone that I've encountered in all my many years in the criminal justice system that has committed the kind of monstrous and the number of monstrous crimes that you have.
The evidence against Franklin was damning. DNA, ballistics, and the haunting testimony of a lone survivor painted a picture of methodical violence. Investigators had discovered hundreds of photos of unconscious or vulnerable women in Franklin's home, images that hinted at the full extent of his predation.
Then you're going to hear about several other crimes, including the murder of 5 other women, as well as a kidnap and gang rape. That they dragged her and forced her into their vehicle, drove her out to a vacant field where they stopped the car, threatened her with a knife, gang raped her, and took photographs of her.
Despite overwhelming proof, Franklin never uttered a word in his defense, nor showed any remorse. His silence was deafening, a final insult to the families who had waited decades for answers. In the courtroom, victim after victim's family stood to testify, Rochelle Johnson, whose mother was killed in 1985, described growing up in a shadow of grief, learning only as a child that some guy had murdered her mother. Others expressed relief that justice had been served, though the scars of their loss would never heal.
He told me that my mom was, killed by a guy that they didn't know who was the one who did it, and he was still out free.
Judge Kennedy's final words were resolute. Franklin was sentenced to death for the murders of 9 women and a teenage girl. The non-death sentences added up to life plus 25 years. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, with the grim understanding that the moratorium on executions in California might soon mean he would die of natural causes before facing the needle. Franklin's death in 2020 left many questions unanswered. How many more women had he killed? And why did he stop for 14 years, only to begin again? Some cases take decades to uncover their secrets, and the next story is no exception. The shocking truth behind this one would leave families and investigators stunned for years. Canadian couple murder case. In November 1987, young sweethearts Tanya Van Cuylenberg, 18, and Jacob, 20, embarked on a road trip from British Columbia to Seattle. What was meant to be a short adventure turned into a tragedy. Tanya's body was found abandoned down an embankment in rural Skagit County, Washington, shot in the back of the head. 2 days later, Jay's body was discovered under a bridge in Monroe, Washington, beaten and strangled with red dog collars and twine. For over 30 years, the case remained unsolved, until a discarded coffee cup led investigators to a suspect using groundbreaking genetic genealogy.
Yesterday, we took into custody a 55-year-old SeaTac man who is suspected of the 1987 murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenberg. William Earl Talbot II has been booked into the Snohomish County Jail on one count of first-degree murder on a warrant out of Skagit County.
The courtroom was packed when William Earl Talbot II, a former trucker, faced trial for the brutal murders. The somber weight of 3 decades of pain and unanswered questions hung in the air. Talbot, now in his late 50s, was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. His demeanor shifted throughout the trial, oscillating between stoic detachment and moments of visible unease. When the prosecutors recounted the evidence, a chilling combination of DNA found on the victims and the novel graphic genealogy techniques used to identify Talbot, family members of Tanya and Jay exchanged glances filled with hope and vindication. The prosecution built a compelling narrative, describing how the couple's last days were marked by their trust and care for each other, betrayed by a violent and callous killer. As the court clerk read the charges, Talbot's fear began to show. His hands fidgeted, and his defense attorney rested a calming hand on his shoulder, whispering reassurances as the counts of murder were detailed. Talbot blinked rapidly, his eyes darting to the family members of the victims, who sat stoically in the gallery. A few family members smiled, tears streaming down their faces as they listened to the charges. A small victory in their long fight for justice. The jury returned a guilty verdict. Talbot was sentenced to life in prison, a decision met with quiet but palpable satisfaction from the victims' families. As the sentence was delivered, Talbot appeared to sink into himself. For a fleeting moment, he seemed overcome with emotion, his usual stoicism replaced with a look of fear and regret. The victims' families, who had endured over 3 decades of anguish, embraced one another. For them, justice had finally been served, even if it could never bring Tanya and Jay back. Mysteries like these aren't just stories. They're glimpses into the unknown, into the edges of what we think we understand. For every unanswered question, there's a possibility, somewhere out there, of the truth. Will these cases ever be solved, or will they remain shadowed by speculation and secrecy? One thing's certain: the deeper you look, the stranger they become. Thanks for watching, and let us know in the comments which case chilled you the most.